Hello, everybody. I'm Brian Levine, and welcome to The Gould Standard, a podcast brought to you by the Glenn Gould Foundation. We bring you conversations with some of the most remarkable people from all across the world of the arts. If music, theater, poetry, film, painting, novels, or now, digital blockchain art, if you're really rich, are what draw you in like a moth to a light bulb, come on in for a conversation that I'm sure you'll find illuminating. Now, while you're stopping by under our neon sign, please do take a moment to press like, share, and subscribe. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please kindly leave your reviews, pose your questions, and be part of our community of friends and supporters. And to get more simply wonderful words, images, and sounds, you can pay a visit to our website, www.glenngould.ca. And while you're there, you'll notice a donate button. We are a registered Canadian charity, and if you would make a gift to us, we would be extremely grateful. Today, I'm really delighted to be welcoming an artist I've admired for many years, a man whose creativity really spreads out in almost every conceivable direction. He is among the most respected screen actors alive, but his accomplishments extend to painting, poetry, photography, music, publishing, and more recently, directing films. He is a musician with 21 albums to his credit, including collaborations with the hugely versatile composer, songwriter, and multi-instrumentalist Buckethead, more than 15 books, including his poetry and photography. He has his own publishing house, which creates beautiful books, and more recently he directed his first film, Falling, in which he also stars. It's a tough, honest, and often uncomfortable film about a son's effort to connect and reconcile with his bigoted father, who is in the early stages of dementia. And for legions of fans of J.R.R. Tolkien's fantasy epic, The Lord of the Rings, he will also always be the king, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, Isildur's heir, and the High Lord of Gondor and Arnor. He also chaired the 2018 Glenn Gould Prize jury, which selected the great Jessie Norman as our laureate, and he was Master of Ceremonies at her award ceremony and concert in Toronto the following year. And last year, he honored us by joining the board of directors of the Glenn Gould Foundation. Of course, I'm speaking of Viggo Mortensen. Viggo, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Nice to see you.
It's great to see you. And where are you right now, and what are you working on at the moment?
Well, in this year plus of the pandemic, I haven't, like most people, been able to travel. And I suddenly find myself on the other side of the world. I'm in Sydney, Australia. I'm in confinement. Here, they're very strict about their COVID procedures. They took a page from New Zealand's approach, and there's a good reason why in New Zealand and Australia there's practically no cases. I mean, the other day I read in the paper here that there was one case in Sydney, one person testing positive, and the alarm bells went off. What should we do? What should we do? And they did tracing, and they went to every single person that person had seen in probably the past week or so or more. And they test everyone. I mean, they really are they're sparing no expense in those efforts. And when I arrived at the airport here, like anybody coming from outside of Australia, military police escort of a bus, you get on a bus and each person comes off individually and goes to specific hotels, kind of a lottery where you end up. And they're polite, but they're very strict, and it takes hours before you actually set foot in your hotel room. And once you go in, you can't even set one foot outside in the hallway, nothing. There's a guard sitting there, polite, but there's someone on each floor, and they keep an eye on it, and nobody must leave for 2 weeks. And, you're setting up food, you put out your trash, whatever, you're given some detergent, you have a small washing machine, you can wash your clothes. It's, taxpayer expense, to some degree, to a great degree. So you can look at it and say, well, that's very expensive. That's crazy. We can't do that here. If you think about it, what they're doing is in the long run going to be a lot cheaper than what has happened in Canada, the US, Europe, most everywhere else in the world other than New Zealand and Australia. Because it's a devastating impact on the economy. The constant spikes in COVID and just, businesses being shut down, all that. Here, I look out the window from my confinement and I see people walking arm in arm without masks. I mean, you saw anybody who's a tennis fan and saw the Australian Open, the end of January, I guess it was. People in the stands, watching tennis, not wearing masks. Most of them you can if you want to. It's not frowned upon. It's not really necessary here,
Right.
and so it's just quite. It's amazing what they're doing.
Yeah, it's actually, I think you're right. I mean, it's certainly cheaper than having, let's say, a quarter of all your small businesses go bankrupt. And, I think that, you know, at a personal level, it seems to me that, where we're living and maybe in the US and some other countries, we're kind of like the mice behind the baseboard, and the cat is prowling around outside. And every so often we stop hearing the cat, so we go out to check it out, and then a few of us get eaten and we scamper back in. And, maybe the better idea is to stay inside behind the baseboard until the cat starves to death, and then we can come out.
That's a good idea. Yeah, I mean, it's what's happening in most other places in the world is penny wise, pound foolish, I guess.
Yeah.
But it's not just with COVID. This is an issue that's been a political football in most countries for ages.
Yeah.
Even in Canada, where there's a much better health care system, for the whole country than there is in the U.S. It's more akin to what people have in Europe. But even so, it's a political football, and people are constantly saying, "Well, we should cut this, cut that," and prevention is the way, and that's what
Yes.
they're doing in Australia and New Zealand. Let's think ahead. Let's take a long view of it and do what makes sense.
Yep.
I would hope that most countries would learn from this pandemic, which won't be the last, I'm sure. Um, that stinting on healthcare or running the healthcare system like a business. Well, if it doesn't give a profit, we must privatize. We must cut this, cut that. I think there are certain things, education, culture, and certainly healthcare above all. If you don't have your health, you have nothing. Those things can't be run for profit. You can always make efforts to run it more efficiently, but I would hope that people would come to their senses about that. I don't think it will happen because politics will always come into play. People will get elected based on, you know, poo-pooing the status quo in terms of the healthcare system,
Right.
education, culture. But the result right now is that most countries are in disarray, understaffed, under-equipped. They're overrun in the hospitals. Concert halls are closed. Cinemas are closed. Theaters are closed. Museums are by and large closed. Some places they open uh, against the better judgment of the experts, science, and medicine. And it is what it is. We
Right.
have a chaotic situation here. I think they're doing something different, which I admire. And I don't mind being confined. I accept it and I understand. I'll be here 2 weeks. I'm a week into it and I'm okay with it. I mean, each person reacts differently. I'm happy to be on my own. I have time to
Right.
read, think, and
Yep. Well, I think you're right about all of that. I think, you know, we all long for the day when we have politicians who have enough leadership and enough commitment to the public good that when they come under pressure from lobbies and interest groups and think tanks and so on, they basically sort of check their inner barometer about what's right for the public, which starts with them surviving and having a decent standard of living and, decent security and healthcare and so on. And then they basically turn to those interest groups and pressure groups and give them the middle finger. And speaking of deft segues, David Cronenberg in Falling, speaking of the middle finger, I thought that was actually just far enough removed that I could make that segue. But anyway, I did want to talk a little bit about Falling because it really is a remarkable film. It was very shattering, but it stayed with me a long time. And, of course, there's a certain shock value because Lance Henriksen's character, Willis, says, horrible, shocking things. And you're also dealing with the very dramatic situation of a very self-reliant individual who's, being forced to confront or trying to deny confronting his own mortality and the loss of himself through dementia. So that part really, but there are so many layers and nuances to the film. It's a tremendously thoughtful film, and you're wonderful in it. Your direction is wonderful. The music is wonderful. I guess I'm taking on myself the role of reviewer to say everyone who hasn't seen it, go see it. Um, but one of the things that really struck me about it is what a study in contrasts it is. There's a very powerful urban rural contrast. John is living in Los Angeles and living a very much more refined and less rustic life than his father, who's in an upstate New York farm where he raised the family. You've got obviously a gay straight divide between the father and the son. You've got some political differences, to put it mildly, and and I know you've said that there are elements of your own family life and experience in this. Where do those dividing lines fall in terms of how you ultimately drew the balancing lines between the fact and the fiction in the film?
Well, it was a story that I started writing right after my mother's funeral. She had had dementia for a few years, several years before she passed away. She also had Parkinson's. And, that's something, dementia is something that's my family has a lot of history with that, both sides of my family. My father's from Denmark and family there, uncles, grandparent, aunt, couple uncles with it. Then my father died after my mother also, and on my mother's side, a lot of people too. So it's something I was familiar with. And after her funeral, I was, as happens when someone that you're close to passes, the image of them, their words, the sound of their voice, smell, everything about them is very present. You're looking at photographs, perhaps videos, you're looking at things they wrote, finding letters, and so they're very present. And with the passing of time after a funeral, for someone you care about, those things fade a little bit, and at least in their immediacy, how they impact you on an emotional level on a day to day basis. That's natural. Just like the memory of the pain of breaking your leg or something, it fades. Your mind protects you in that sense. And I didn't want it to fade, I suppose. So I started writing these things down, everything I could remember, everything I personally could remember about her, the things I'd heard at the funeral, stories about her, different versions of the stories that I knew well from people that were at the funeral, which I thought was interesting. That sort of Rashomon thing where,
Yep.
everybody's recollection is different. How subjective memory is. I thought that was interesting. So I started writing these things down, not intending to try to make a movie of it. In fact, I was trying to make a movie from a different screenplay at the time. And I had at that point been trying for 20 plus years to direct a movie from something I'd written. I'd written several screenplays. So I was in the middle of trying to get another story made, a completely different story. And, I got home and a few days later I thought, oh, maybe I'll look at these notes, and I look at my notebook. What did I write down about my mother? And I looked at it, because what I ended up doing as I was writing these notes, it was a long plane trip. I started putting it in. I thought, well, this is a good story. All these jumps in time and different recollections that people have and these tensions within any family. So, and the issue of dementia, how that affects memory, perception, Uh, and I wrote a story that was fictional, really, using these feelings about my mom. And I just put it aside because I had other things to do, including try to keep making that other movie happen. And a few days later, I read it. I looked at it thinking, it's probably not going to be that great. It's like you wake up in the middle of the night and you hear some music and you write down an idea. for a song or a piece of music or a poem, or she's got, this would make a great story, and scribble it down. You look at it the next day thinking, well, that's going to be special. And you look at it over breakfast, and generally it's sort of disjointed. It's not very good. That's what I find anyway. Those things that you
Hmm.
write down in the middle of the night thinking, oh, that's genius. I can't wait to look at that after my coffee. And it's nothing to it, really. It's not very original. And, and in this case, I liked it. I liked the structure a lot. And I thought, this is promising. And I can picture these memory fragments. It's very visual. And maybe it's not a novella or a short story. Maybe it's a movie, So in my spare time and evenings, I started writing it out as a screenplay. And that I was able to write that quite quickly, much faster than any other screenplay I'd written. And when the other project fell apart, I couldn't raise the money, as it happened so many times over the years. I tried to get this one done, and it took me about 4 years to get it made. But I did find Lance Henriksen very early on. I did have my cinematographer, Marcel Ziskin, Danish cinematographer, really good. Carol Spear from Canada, production designer I'd worked on Cronenberg movies with. So we had a little nucleus, and I just kept trying to raise the money. It took a while, but the story that we ended up telling, what you see on screen, what you can, it's on all platforms. If you want to watch it, you can find it in Canada and US, anywhere pretty much, almost. It's basically that short story. It's the same essential structure, the same themes, and with a great central performance by Lance Henriksen, one
Oh
that
yeah,
will be remembered, I think, for a long time.
absolutely.
I feel he hasn't gotten the credit he ought to have. He's had recognition, reviews and audience reactions, when I presented the movies have been extraordinary, especially towards his performance. But just the times we're in,
Yeah, but
it's
but but it,
he's
it
like you say, he's a difficult character. He's hard to take, some of the things he says, but it's an extraordinary layered performance.
yes,
I don't know if it wasn't an 80-year-old white man,
yeah,
perhaps perhaps he would have gotten to be on some of the so-called experts lists of great performances this year. I would put his performance up against anyone's this year.
yeah. Well, I agree, and I think that part of it is it's a bit of a departure for him in terms of a lot of the other roles that he's associated with. But the other thing about it, and I think this may be part of the story, is this film deals with a whole variety of different discomfort zones, and one of them is, this divide between, saying really, awful and for most of us offensive and, you know, unacceptable things. And, as good liberals, we're supposed to basically say they're deplorables and we will have nothing left to do with them. But your character, John, really, despite whatever hurt and rage he may feel, he suppresses it and keeps trying and trying and trying to forge or reforge that connection with his father. And
Some
I
people have
mean,
taken issue with that. They're like, that's impossible. You can't do that. That's unforgivable. He must be written off.
yes,
Why
he,
should we listen? That they find it not, I don't know if they find it incredible. I think they just are offended by it. And, that's the world we live in. There are lots of people like that. There are lots of family conflicts. If you're a younger person looking at this movie and looking at the character that Lance Henriksen plays, Willis, if you're young and maybe you haven't had to care for one of your parents or grandparents, or I don't know, it may be easier to say, well, when someone talks to me like that, that's it. I'm
yep,
done.
yep,
It's a lot easier said than done in some cases, the case in this story. And I don't like movie stories or any kind of art that tells you what to think. I'm not a big fan of, agitprop or,
yep.
propaganda type art. I think, I like to respect the audience's intelligence, and you can do whatever you want. In this case, the character I play, the son of Willis, I know that this man needs help mentally and physically. I also know that if he's going to accept any help at all from anyone, and he might not in the end, it's probably only going to be from me. And the only way I'm going to keep that connection, tenuous as it may be most of the time, that communication, the line of communication open with my father in this story, is by swallowing a lot of horrible, treatment, behavior, language. He makes a conscious choice. He even talks about it early in the story. There's a lengthy scene where the father is really being abusive. It's late at night. Combination of his dementia, but also of his instinctive shoot first, ask questions later attitude toward life and people. It's like, if I'm not sure that you're offending me, I'm going to assume you are, and I'm going to attack you. That's the best.
Right.
The best defense is a good offense. That's what and it's just, invective after invective, homophobic statements, racist, whatever he can do to provoke me. And I can't be completely sure. Is he doing this intentionally? Is he confused? Is this dementia? In any case, if I want to keep the line of communication open and get him to accept some help from me, I'm going to have to take it.
Yeah.
And that's a choice that he makes, and he hangs in there. Most of the story, at a certain point, the son cannot bear it anymore. And mostly it has to do with the mother, the way the father talks about the mother. It just more so than the homophobic statements, the racism and the general misogyny and intolerance. It's the memory of the mother that really, it gets to him, how she's spoken about. And, that was, the mother is, in a way, even though it's not played by Hannah Gross, brilliant Canadian actress. She, she, uh, she does a beautiful job. And even though she's not in the movie all the time, for me, she's the moral fulcrum, the conscience of the piece in a way. And after all, the story, even though it's fictional, is based on my feelings and memories of my own mother. So that's the issue in the end. But it's in terms of storytelling, it's an intentional, unusual way to create dramatic tension for a long time, where not a conflict at the center of that tension in the normal sense, where two people are battling, but one person's attacking, the other person's evading, changing the subject, resisting the temptation to respond in kind, and so forth, until they can't anymore. There's a tensing of this connect until it just breaks. And that was the storytelling approach, but it was also what I felt was the right thing in that relationship.
Yeah, it absolutely builds to a really powerful climax. And while some people may have been sort of sitting, waiting, cheering, wondering when it was going to happen, at the end of it, it doesn't feel like, finally he gives the old coot a bit of his own back. It's really, what needs to happen in order to achieve some resolution. And I for me, Willis is continually provoking John, but that feels a little bit like a fear reaction. He knows at some level that he's essentially, parts of him are disappearing. And it seems to me like a desperate plea to say, I'm still here, damn it. And if I get you to respond and react, there's an
I'm
affirmation.
alive.
Yeah, I'm alive still.
Yeah. Don't try to fix me. And,
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
lot of, yeah.
Yeah.
No, and
So,
Lance really went for it. What's great about Lance's work in this, he would always say to me, don't let me get caught acting. I said, well, I don't think I will, the way we're going. And I didn't, and he wanted to live it. He didn't want to, there are other performances I've seen, including this year, without naming names, but where dementia is depicted. And and it's more of a performance. And in some cases, it's there's an obvious to me as an actor, I see an obvious effort to ingratiate oneself with the audience,
Yes.
like clowning around, doing. I'll show you all these things I can do, all the skills that I have technically as an actor and all that. But it's like, what is the difference is that what Lance is doing is life,
Yeah.
giving you a life uncompromisingly. And it's brutal at times, but there are so many fine layers in there. There's so much. You can see the insecurity. You can see the fear, not to excuse anything, but you can see it. He's a
Right.
human being. He's a real human being.
Yep.
He's not messing around. It's like, this is it. I'm
Exactly.
all my flaws. This is me, rather than let me see what can I do here to get your attention as an audience. It's like, there's a consistency. There's also the issue with dementia, from my long experience with it in my family, in depictions of that ailment, which is different in each person, but there are certain consistent things that I find, troubling, and
Hmm.
most other depictions of it, plays and movies I've seen about it, which is that they depict someone who's, generally speaking, confused. And if they try to show their point of view, it's the confused point of view. And my experience is that it's the caretaker, the observer, the caregiver, who is generally more confused. Those people, once they're in that place, they're seeing and hearing and remembering these things. It's real. It's not,
Right.
unless disturb that by correcting them and saying, no, 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 that person you said you just had lunch with died 30, 40 years ago. Then then they will be confused and upset and, you know,
Yep.
but otherwise they're generally not confused. And that's what I wanted to show with Lance, not just hoping that he would give a great performance, which he does. He goes beyond anything I expected, but the use of, what you can do in film, how you can use images and sound and where it's placed, music to some degree, um, to create this alternate present that they're living in.
Right. Well, all I can say is bravo. Direct another one soon, please.
I would love to. I would
Yeah.
love to.
As far as I'm concerned, if I had a great big checkbook, I'd be writing you a check. Um, uh, I'd like to kind of shift gears and talk a little bit about your early life, since in a way, falling takes you back into that territory to some extent, because it seems to me that your childhood was kind of an unusual mix of cosmopolitanism and small town American life, all sort of rolled into one. Let me see if I have this right. You were born in Watertown, upstate New
No,
York.
no,
No,
I was born in New York City,
you were.
and yeah, the events that you see that are combination rural and you know that you see in the movie there are some things taken in the sort of flashbacks, the whole duck story that sort of could be a short movie on its own that serves to introduce the family, the fate of this duck, and what happens
Right.
with it. Um, those are taken from real memories, but they didn't happen in North America. They happened in South America. When I was an
Uh-huh.
infant, my dad got a job in South America, and I was raised until I was, first decade of my life, I spent largely down there in Argentina. 1 year in Venezuela, they don't remember, but the rest in Argentina. So, but the duck story that happened, but it happened down there.
Ah,
Yeah.
that's really interesting. So essentially, you were brought up at the beginning almost as a South American boy, speaking Spanish. Was Spanish your first language, or was it kind of a parallel track linguistically?
Well, the first words I heard, from my mother were in English. She's American. My dad's Danish. But very quickly I was immersed in Spanish. And so, they were parallel as I was growing up. And my two younger brothers, um, were raised, from the get go down there. And so the three of us, until we left, when my parents split up and went back to actually the area where falling takes place, northern New York State, up near the Canadian border, across from Lake Ontario and St. Lawrence River, that area. Um, we only spoke Spanish
Uh-huh.
together. I remember when we were traveling north with my mother, when I was just about 11, when they were 8, 6, um, we were speaking Spanish, and I kept saying to them, especially to the youngest who refused to speak English, even though he understood it. I said, we're going to have to speak English when we get there because our cousins and the other people, they're not going to understand you in Spanish. And I know you can understand it. So we got to do that. And so we made that transition as kids do quite quickly. But I, since I was older, I guess language, culture, some of those things were already kind of embedded in me from Argentina, and that
Yeah.
stayed with me ever since. In a way, perhaps a little more than they have their memories, but I have, there was an imprint on me that was stronger just because I was older, of course, when I moved.
Right. Well, I would think that, just for example, in my own experience in South America, versus the general reserve of North Americans, that, um, openness of expression, less demand for physical space, a greater readiness for emotional intimacy. And, you find yourself sort of, not too far from the frosty Canadian border, and, people are a little bit more, um, backed off. So that's got to have been, I mean, also you were in Argentina. I'm sure that you were too young to appreciate it at a time of real political ferment. It was,
No, I remember. I mean, I
yeah,
was old enough. I remember. I mean, before the years of dictatorship in the 70s, there were things like that happening, 50s and 60s. But I remember the late 60s, where President Onganía was president, and he was a military person. Who was essentially that was a dictatorship as
yeah,
well. It didn't become as extreme in terms of the people tortured and killed and disappeared
yeah,
as happened in the mid 70s, but there was always trouble. I
right.
remember more.
Well, that's another difference. A sense of kind of pervasive anxiety. Maybe not as bad as when Perón came back for his third term, but, you know, if there's, the potential of political violence, of course, some of that's now come home
But as a kid,
to,
you
yeah.
accept, you don't have anything to compare it to.
Uh-huh.
That's you grow up in, and it seems, well, that's life. You don't think
Right.
that it's unusual. I mean, it's only looking back at it that I appreciate that aspect. But what the immediate effects, when we moved up to the Canadian border, basically, to be with my mother's side of the family, where we lived for a while at the grandparents' house until she made her own way, and we married and all that. The immediate things that I remember were sort of cultural differences, where in Argentina, even more than in Spain, men will kiss each other and embrace, and even walk down the street arm in arm, and that's not so unusual. There's Italian influence and other things, and so I found myself having to stop myself as a kid from hugging other boys and
Right.
things like and there was just a different, less tactile
Yeah.
kind of interaction socially, and so but that you adjust quickly as a kid. But I noticed.
Yeah. A couple of bloody noses will get you that.
What are you doing? Let go of me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Exactly.
I mean, I realized it quickly. I mean, we
Yeah.
had visited a few times during the first decade of my life. I remember going back with my mother. I mean, she went back when she was about to give birth to each of my brothers, so they were born, you know, in the U.S. But so I mean, I knew a little bit,
Yeah.
and I knew how my mother was, but my mother was quite affectionate.
Right.
She was tactile. So it fit in the way things were in Argentina. Anyway, that was a big difference, just the
Yeah.
way things were. In the U.S., the way people interacted was a certain formality in terms of physically, but there was an informality in terms of language, speech. I found, it's just different.
Right. And I've I've read that your mother's mother, your maternal grandmother, was from Nova Scotia originally. Is that true?
Uh, no, her grandfather, Walter,
Her
his name
grandfather.
was Walter Atkinson. Yeah, he was from Nova Scotia. Yeah.
Okay. You see that I'm sort of laying the groundwork for claiming you as a closet Canadian, especially since you're wearing that T-shirt. Um, you know, but your yes, your love of the Habs is well documented.
I'm happy to be adopted by Karen. No, I've always not just that my grandfather was from there, but I've living across the border and going there a lot during my adolescence. I got to know where people were and the landscapes, and I liked it. And then as a young adult, and since then I've crisscrossed Canada many times. I've worked there as an actor. I've crossed Canada by train, by car more than once. Not quite as many times as I've done the United States, but I do know where the capital of Canada is. I know that they are provinces and not states and
Yes.
territories.
That,
Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of Americans that don't know those things, which is strange. But
well, it's when you're the big dog, you don't have to take as much notice of the little dog, even if the little dog is geographically bigger. Uh, but and in sort of going through this line of conversation, I've been kind of trying to get to the lead up of what made you first think about becoming an actor. So let me just sort of say, after you graduated from college, you spent some time in Europe, kind of odd jobbing it. Would that be right?
yeah, I had even during college, I had a really strong connection always with my the Danish side of the family, my cousins there. Um, I love my cousins in the United States. I have a good relationship with them, but there was something about, and maybe Denmark's a little different than Sweden, Norway, generalization, but into people are pretty, sometimes people jokingly call Denmark the Italy of the North or something.
Yes,
People are very warm and they can be, there's a lot of embracing and hugging, and people can be a little more open about their emotions. Not everyone, but my cousins certainly were that way. And
yes,
so whenever we visited them from time to time, summers or sometimes for Christmas, I would always have a great connection with them. And the language barrier sort of disappeared quickly, and it was just, we had a lot of fun. I felt, so I went there once I had a choice. Once I was an adult, I would go there a lot and I would work. And during my university years, summers I'd spent there working and living there. And then as soon as I finished, I moved there because I felt good being there. And I spent a few years living there. Yeah.
well, it's beautiful. I remember back when I was in the record business, we had a distributor for our record label in Denmark, and he said, we're not like the other Scandinavians. We used to be Vikings. That means that we weren't good at bottling it up. We like to drink and rampage and say rude things.
Yeah, there's culturally there can be, you can see that in some of the TV series that come out of there. There's sometimes they're very well written. There's a high level, technically in terms of directors, performers. I mean, it's a country of between 5 and 6 million people, but they produce an inordinate amount of really good television and film, theater. There are a lot of storytelling is really important there. It's very much a part of the culture, I think. It
Right.
is most places, but it's as important as sports or anything else there.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so, yeah, but I didn't, even at that time, I hadn't, I always I liked movies. I liked going to the theater. I had always been intrigued by movie storytelling, but I never imagined that I would be part of that. That was given to me by my mother, really. I mean, first time I went to a movie house, I was about 3. And that was in Argentina. And all through
Uh-huh.
those years in Argentina, my mom took me constantly. She'd say, "You want to go to the movies?" Yeah. Rainy day, or she'd
Yep.
get me after school. And we saw a lot of movies, and movies that were for adults,
Yeah.
and we had great conversations. I can remember them. I mean, the first one I really remember seeing all the way through and having a long conversation with my mom about was Lawrence of Arabia, for
Oh,
example.
wow.
There, I would have been 4. And at that time, there's still a couple left, but at that time, there was a street, La Valle, in Buenos Aires, that where there were about 20 giant movie houses, and some of them had seating for 2,000 people, and they were grand movie houses. And I saw all of the big, I saw Argentine movies and English, British movies, European ones, and any decent, U.S. movie. Uh, my mom would go see it, and I would go see them with her, and we'd have
Mm.
conversations about it. It all seemed normal to me, like anything does as a kid. And then when I grew up, I realized, oh, most moms don't do that, and they
Uh-huh.
certainly conversations as if a couple of screenwriters are talking. She would talk about what wasn't in the movie, or
Hmm.
what the music did at that point, or I know he was feeling that, but he didn't say it. Didn't you think that was interesting?
Oh,
And those are the conversations. So
amazing. And remarkable that the first you remember is Lawrence of Arabia. If someone had tapped you on the shoulder as a little boy and said, you know, X years from now, you're going to be sitting across from that man, Omar Sharif, in a tent acting with him, that would have probably blown your mind.
yeah, I would have. I would have thought, oh wow. But my mom was smitten with Omar Sharif. She wasn't generally sort of a movie fan that was into the stars. She was into the stories.
Hmm.
That's what we talked about. But Omar Sharif had a special place, I think, in her fantasy life, or I don't know what.
Yes.
When we saw that movie, and then also Dr. Shivago, she went on and on about it.
Oh, yeah.
And there was an interesting, great thing that happened was the movie I worked with Omar in was called Hidalgo, and he played this sheikh, and I was a cowboy, I mean, who went to compete in this long desert horse race. And when we had the premiere, it was in on Hollywood Boulevard, in one of those big old movie theaters there. And I invited my mom and my stepdad were out visiting, and I said, "Well, let's go. You can come to the premiere of this movie." And so they came, and it was big event. I had talked to Omar during the shoot about my mom, being fascinated with him and how I had these memories seeing him on screen when I was a little boy. And I had admired his work since then. All that. But I talked a lot about my mother, and so when he showed up, I was standing talking with my mother outside the theater just before the premiere was about to start. And I saw him, and then he pointed. It's like, "Is that her?" And I said, and so he came over. And he walked right up to her, which sort of startled my stepfather. He says, "Man, what's he doing?" Um, and he said, "You must be Grace." And we'll remember. And he was like blushing, and then he took her hand and raised it, never taking his eyes away from hers, and kissed it, but didn't quite touch his lips on her
Yes.
hand. It was like
Yes.
very, very elegant, very correct. And then, he said, "It's a pleasure to meet you." And she couldn't even talk. And then he
Uh,
walked and then said, "Viggo, I'll see you in there." I said, "Yes, thank you. Nice to see you, Omar." Walked away, and my stepdad was like, smoke was coming out of his ears. "What the hell? Who was that? What's going on here?" It was an interesting closing of a circle.
but
Which,
what a gracious thing for him to do. And he strikes me as someone who grew from a very intense person to a very sweet-natured person over the course of his life. Although, of course, being a fine actor, you could never really tell.
well, he was always had a certain elegance about him, but he was he was a bad boy too. He would, if you had even a few drinks in him, he could be belligerent and always witty, but sometimes he could be a bit cutting, a bit
Right.
cruel, I suppose. And I saw that sometimes. He had a regimen, which is interesting. He wouldn't eat anything all day long. When we were shooting on the desert, he might have a glass of water, but even that, he wouldn't have anything, breakfast, lunch, or anything. And then when we'd finish shooting, he would he would have a couple of scotches. He'd go down to the bar and have a couple of whiskeys, and then dinner. And he'd want people to be there. He'd invite people for dinner all the time. And after a while, I was like, I can't do this every night. I gotta
Yeah, yeah,
get you know. But I did it a few times, and he would keep drinking whiskey and then wine, and come on, more. And he would be telling these amazing stories all through dinner. But by the end of dinner, he could get caustic,
uh-huh,
and that was the drink. But he was
yeah,
always entertaining, I have to say.
yeah. Well, you returned from Europe to America, and I am guessing that somewhere around the time you got back, acting was on your radar. What put the idea in your head, aside from your fondness for movies through your mother, and how did you get connected to the point where you could actually get cast in significant films?
Um, it was, the reason I decided to give it a try, going from just, an audience member who was interested in movie stories, uh, um, to being entertained, going from that to actually wondering how it was done, how was the illusion created. That started to happen when I was in Europe, when I started going to movie houses that would show art houses, so-called art houses, where there'd be two different movies on each night. They change every day or every couple of days, and you'd see another couple. And that's when I started seeing more. I started learning about the history of cinema more. Prior to when I started at age 3 watching movies and whatever I'd seen on television and so forth. Seeing Asian movies, seeing early Bergman and, Visconti and Ozu and Bresson and all the great filmmakers, Tarkovsky films, and just really seeing the wide range of storytelling. And I don't know, at some point I was struck by, this idea uh, of being transported. How does that happen? That I step out of a movie theater and I'm shocked that it's raining and I'm in the city, and it's night. It's not daytime in a desert or on the Russian steppes or something. Uh, there's something, and how is it that I'm so moved and driven to think about my own family and personal relations, and that at least for a moment when it really works, the storytelling and the acting, uh, I'm I'm inspired to rethink where I am and what's going on and what I've done so far in my life and what I'd like to do now, even
Yeah.
driven at times. I should call this person. I haven't talked to him for a long time. This has affected me. I think
Okay.
we could make up. Or just these things that good stories can do for you. Music can do the same thing, obviously. And, and so I decided to try it, you know, and I didn't know how to do it, but I moved from Denmark, where I was living at the time, to New York City, because the person I was in a relationship with at the time went there. So I followed her. And I started thinking about this. Well, how does one do that? So I essentially looked in the yellow pages. It's like, well, theaters, and how do you try out for a play and so forth. And so I called one of them. It had a nice name. It's Actors Repertory Theater. Well, that sounds good. They do lots of plays. I didn't know it was a theater workshop. Yeah, they did do plays once in a while, but it was essentially a school. Right? And so I called them on the phone. I said, what's the play? And they said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, what can I try out? What are you doing? I said, well, yes, anyone can try out. you can come in next Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. and bring two pieces. And I said, two pieces of what? And they said, well, two, what? Memorize two texts and you come in and perform that, and we'll see whether we have room for you or not. And they still hadn't told me what the play was, but I thought, okay, well, so I found two things and something there. One was this Karen Blixen, Isaac Dinesen short story that features, Jack the Ripper. And so I just told the bits of dialogue from the story that he spoke, and I made this monologue from that. And then for some reason, there was an old traditional Irish song that I knew that had to do with, young Irishmen being conscripted by the British Army and forced to go, on pain of death to join the army, basically, and fight for the empire. And so I performed this odd monologue I'd cobbled together and sang the song. And probably wasn't what they were expecting, but they thought there was something there. So they said, well, you can come and you can be part of the class. And I go to the class. And well, what's the play? It says, there is no play. There's a class. There's a workshop. And you can come next week and start. And it costs this and this much money and so forth. And so, I was like most actors, I was working odd jobs to pay the rent and to pay for these classes and moving furniture, bartender, selling ice cream on the street, whatever, odd jobs. And so that's where I started. And because it was anonymous, I didn't know any of these people in the class. I felt like, well, if it doesn't work, I'll just try something else. And so I just started, but it kept my interest, even though it took a long time, many years before I could make a living from it. I kept, did hundreds of auditions, but I liked the process. Each audition taught me something, taught me to be flexible. Each casting director, each text, I learned to adapt and prepare each audition in that sense. I wasn't very lucky. I mean, I was lucky in the sense that right off the bat, I would progress callback auditions to the point where it'd be, you know, leading roles in movies and sometimes TV shows be between me and another person. But I never got those roles. I mean, and I started, it was frustrating, but it was still interesting enough to me. The more I learned about the storytelling aspect of it, the more I liked it. I'd always loved it. But now I was seeing how you created the illusion and I liked it. I liked the process, even though I wasn't getting anywhere. And my mom always supported me in that regard. My dad was more practical and said, well, you don't seem to be able to make a living from this. So maybe you should try something else. Or maybe you should put on a suit and tie. Oh, next one. What's your next, tryout? I said, well, it's called an audition and it's for a serial killer, and I don't think wearing a suit and tie would really, well, it's always good to wear a tie. And I said, well, so I stopped talking to him about it, telling him what I was doing. But my mom was very interested and she knew a lot. She would know who the director was and what they'd done. And she was like kind of a film historian in a way.
Yep.
And who else is in it? I said, I don't know, Mom. I don't know much about it. I've just been given these sides, these scenes. I don't even know the whole story. Well, and how are those scenes? And she was like, annoying in a
Yeah.
way, but it was very supportive.
Yep.
And she never questioned I should stick with it. And I think she probably would have been a good actress, had things been different in her life,
Right.
but she was very interested in it. And I not only this Omar Sharif moment, but I was able to share something else with her. When I started getting attention, I mean, I'm not someone who wins awards, but I have been nominated. And one of those times, the first time it really sort of happened was a movie I did with David Cronenberg, one of the Eastern Promises. And
Mhm.
one of those events, the Screen Actors Guild, I invited her to go. She was my date. There's one of these things where they have tables and you're eating and, and you're watching the award show and participating in it sometimes. And that was fantastic. She would see these older actors or directors, actresses, movie personalities, and she would almost always know who they were. Oh, that's so
Yeah.
and so. We directed that movie, or that's her. She used to be married to so and so, and then she did the one good job she did was this. She had very strong.
That's
And we
great.
would be sitting there, and she would say, "Oh, that's John Travolta," and she goes, "Excuse me," and she'd get up and go over and talk.
That's
It's like
great.
all night. It was like, and it was like kind of nerve wracking. I said, "What's she going to do?" And she would get over to that person's table and
Right.
back at me sitting there at the table going,
Yeah.
now
And
it
you're
was like,
wondering, is this the end of my career?
yeah, no, this guy felt like the kid who's suddenly at a certain point in grade school, they start to want to pretend like they don't have parents and they're
Yeah.
embarrassed by the parents driving them to school or walking them to school. And
Right.
I felt a little of that, but I also felt really good because I knew she was having a great time. It was
Yeah.
wonderful. So I wish I'd been able to do that more with her. She became sick, and couldn't really participate in
Yeah.
those sort of
But
things. But
at least she
she
got
did go
some.
to a number of premieres, and she got to experience
That's
that
great.
up close, that world that she had so her whole life been fascinated
Yep.
by.
Exactly. Well, now your first breakthrough was a non-breakthrough because you got cast in Purple Rose of Cairo, but you ended up on the cutting room floor, I understand. So no one's ever seen that. What did you do in that?
I enjoyed that a lot, and I like working for Woody Allen. I think he's one of the greats. And yeah, I was cast. Well, he's notorious for not really saying much to the actors, and even in the audition process, you generally walk in and he doesn't say anything. He just looks at you for a minute or so, and then says, "Well, thank you for coming in," and that's it.
Mm.
He just wants to look at you and see if you would fit the character. And, that's it. And his casting director, I remember before going in his office, he was in New York City, Juliet Taylor, she said, "Now don't be alarmed if it's over very quickly. It's not personal. This is the way it always is." And I said, "Okay." So I walked in his office, sitting there, and he looks at me. He didn't say anything. He's just looking at me up and down. And I sort of looked at a chair, and he didn't say sit down, but I decided to sit down. And after a long, long silence, he was just looking at me and observing me, like scrutinizing me as if I was some kind of specimen. Not rudely, just doing what he does, I guess. Or he does. I said, "Hello," finally. And he nodded and looked at me a little more, and he might have smiled. And then after a bit, seemed very long. It was probably only a couple minutes. It seemed a very long time. He said, "Well, thank you for coming in," which I knew was my cue to leave. And so
Yes.
I got up and said bye and left, and that was it. I go, "Well, that was a disaster, probably." And no, he apparently, the word I got the next day from my agent, "Well, he really liked you and he wants you to be in this movie." I said, "Okay, what's the part?" He said, "Well, you'll find out, I guess, when you get there." I had no idea. So I got there, some mansion out in Long Island, and took train, buses, whatever to get there. And there was a lot of people there. It was a big cocktail Hollywood party scene. And I had very, really long hair at that time. And the first thing I did is just cut it all off and sort of greased my hair, maybe look like an actor from the 1920s, gave me a
Right.
suit. I said, "What am I supposed to do?" And I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you'll be called when it's time for you to do your scene." I said, "What is my scene?" I have no idea. "Oh, but Mr. Allen will explain it to you."
Uh,
And so I'm just looking at the people's clothing and looking at my own. I was like, okay, so it seems to be 1920s, maybe 1930, early 30s. The costumes and the decor. And finally, at one point, after a couple hours, he says, "Okay, you're up, Mortensen." Boom. So I walked in and it was all cameras. Everything was all set up. And they'd obviously been prepping this and they were about to shoot. And there was a lot of people in this cocktail party with their sort of drinks and all that. And a lot of beautiful women and all kinds of stuff and fancy dress. And Woody Allen was talking to this other young actor about my age and just kind of going around and whispering in his ear. And the actor was nodding, nodding. And then Woody Allen said, "Okay, let's try one." And I said, "Well, Mr. Allen, what do you want me to do?" He says, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, what are we what are, what are we doing? And he said, you just react to him. Okay. And I said, okay. And so, sound, action. And, and the guy comes over and he asked me, so what was it like to work on the DeMille picture? And I had no, I said,
Yeah.
so I just made something up. I just decided the way I felt was like a dumb actor who didn't really know what the hell he was doing. So I spoke about, yeah, it was like exhausting. I mean, I was up on this sort of stump, this crossbar, and I had my arms, and I was wearing like this diaper, and I had this weird hat that was made of, like thorns and stuff. And there's this like Roman soldier poking at me with a stick. And it was just, I got sunburned and, as you can see, and it was grueling. I don't know. In other words, the actor was so dumb, he didn't even know he was playing Jesus Christ.
Right, right, right.
And that, of course, that amused Woody Allen, maybe being Jewish and so forth. He thought that was great. And he was laughing. I said, I liked it. And then he said, let's do one more. And I said, what do you want me to do now? He goes, we'll do more or less the same thing. That works. And so I did a variation on that, elaborated a little more, and it became more ridiculous, of course. And I'd never seen that footage, but I heard the next day that he was really happy with it. It was really made his day. And I said, oh, great. And my agent said, that's really good. That's rare. So then, of course, I told my mom, first and foremost, how it went. And then she kept nagging me for the rest of the year. When's it coming out? When's it? I said, well, it's taking a while. And then finally I said, it's coming out next Friday. And I go see it. And she went to see it. And of course, I wasn't in it. I wasn't in the credits. And she called me and accused me of lying to her that I hadn't actually done a movie. And what was I doing down there? This happened to me in another movie as well. Jonathan Demme, Swing Shift. Same thing. I heard a dialogue scene. Very nice one with Goldie Hawn. It was cut out. So this happens more
Yeah.
often than not. And sometimes you're told, usually you're not, that you're not in it. And that's the way it goes. So
Right.
it was a long apprenticeship, which is probably good for me.
Yep.
I'm a late blooming, slow learner. And
But yeah,
I got to learn by being on some shoots, playing small part, many, many auditions. And I learned the ropes watching how crews work together, how the cinematographer and the director talk. I saw examples of bad communication with crews, and, you see the end result. And usually the better movies are the ones where there's been good communication and preparation. So that's what I learned over the years until I started making a living.
but you also had the opportunity to work with a lot of really major directors during that time. I mean, Jane Campion and Brian De Palma, Ridley Scott, Gus Van Sant, just to name a few. And, although, they're not all big roles, I mean, certainly G.I. Jane, that's a pretty big role. In fact, that is really the number 2 role in the film after Demi
Demi Moore.
Moore, right? But you certainly must have seen a lot of different approaches to storytelling and to working with crews and working with casts, and that I'm guessing that you filed that all away, and that by the time you came to Falling, you had a pretty well charged memory bank of
Yeah.
ideas on how to make it all work.
Yeah, that was very helpful. All of that. I mean, much as I wanted to, the first time I tried to get a movie made was 25 years ago that I wanted to direct. And I had already had some of those good experiences, and I might have done okay, but I learned a lot more, in the years after
Right.
first attempt, failed attempt to direct a movie. By the time I got to direct Falling, I had the benefit of learning from all these people and good models, and it was about how to prepare primarily to get rid of as many stumbling blocks and possible problems before you start shooting. But also, most importantly, how do you communicate with the crew and with the actors? What's the most efficient way to do so? And the one thing that all these good directors I've worked with have in common, men and women from different places who have like different impulses, different styles, and so forth. What's consistent about them is that they're not afraid of suggestions, ideas, questions from their crew and cast. They don't take offense.
Right.
They see what they can use. Like anything that can help me make a better story, it's all to the good. Or I bring it on, you know. So that's the way I approached Falling, and we had a great crew in Ontario, and I said that the first day. I said, what I've learned from the best directors is that good idea from a good idea can come from any one of you at any time. So, you know,
Right.
don't be shy because you're only going to help. We have a very short time. We have one crack at telling the story. And, you know, if you have a great idea today, don't mull it over and tell me tomorrow because it'll be too late. You can't go back and shoot today's scene. We don't have
Exactly.
that kind of budget. So, and people, you know, they obliged and they came with lots of good ideas. And the most helpful thing was, and maybe it's partly because they were given that green light to communicate with me and with anybody all the time, is that they started sharing stories about their own family, you know, their own family dynamics that related to our story. You know, they related personal, sometimes very emotional way to the scenes we were playing out, you know, that we were putting together as a team. They would relate to Lance Henriksen's character or the difficulty of communication with someone who has dementia or ideological rifts that you have in families, polarization that happens in some families. And how do you rebuild those bridges? Or maybe you never can. And, you know, that was really helpful. Just knowing that
Yep.
everybody on board, it was more than just a job, you know, for
Yeah.
that crew. So that was wonderful.
And it must have been great validation, the sense that you knew you were onto something because you were touching chords with the life
Yeah.
experiences of people you were actually working with. Now,
Yeah.
yeah, in in that period, there are two films that you appeared in that really kind of stand out for me, outliers in a way, and those are the two you made with Philip Ridley,
Yeah.
The Reflecting Skin and The Passion of Darkly Noon. First of all, because that's two-thirds of his entire cinematic output. So that is kind of pride of place. But also, he's another artist who does a great many things, very difficult to pigeonhole, in many ways difficult to categorize films. What were those experiences like?
I really enjoyed working with Philip. His first, you know, full length feature was The Reflecting Skin, which was shot in Alberta. Um, that would have been the summer of '89, I believe. And I think the movie didn't come out until 1991, but I think it went to the Cannes Film Festival. It had its run of festivals and had its fans, you know. Uh, I enjoy, you know, he was someone who's a painter. I was written some books. Yeah, at that point, he'd been and written some children's stories that were kind of disturbing, but really, really original. And I liked his approach. It was an unusual approach to filmmaking. Um, you know, he didn't know as much, say, at that point anyway, about technology, the camera, and all the tools of filmmaking as say someone like David Cronenberg does. But he had a knack for storytelling. Um, and he had his particular style, and I got along with him quite well, and so I was happy to repeat with him and get the Passion of Dark Noon. But these were difficult movies for him to get financed, very unusual stories, and then he did do a third one, as you say. But unfortunately, he's one of those filmmakers that you wish would get to make more movies. I'm sure he would, but he's written for the theater, and I've seen some of his plays, and he's very he's a good writer.
Yeah.
He's a very thoughtful person, a very sensitive person, a real iconoclast. And I wish he'd get to direct more movies. Hopefully he will again. That was yeah, he's different from all the other directors I've worked with, but a kind person.
Yeah, and you sense that about him, that he came from, a pretty rough part of London. Probably didn't have a lot of advantages, but managed to turn that into a very perceptive, very penetrating art that is sometimes very disturbing. And, by the way, all the best children's books are disturbing, from Brothers Grimm to Roald Dahl. I mean, they really
Chris
are.
Anderson.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Um, I mean, I used to like go into fits over the little match girl when I was
Right.
growing up. But anyway, we we really need to take a few minutes to talk about Lord of the Rings. It was inevitable, but also, you know, even though it's something that is a huge milestone in your career, and there's always this, I mean, you'll never be pigeonholed because your work is so varied, but it is something that stands in people's mind, and it was a huge commitment of time for you. I mean, making these three mammoth films. Um, how did Peter Jackson come to cast you as Aragorn? Had you read Tolkien before?
I had not read Tolkien before, and I'd heard about it. I'd heard about The Hobbit, but I hadn't. For some reason, I had missed all of that, and it was very late. And in fact, they were already filming. Whereas the other actors had been there for weeks and months in some cases, training, learning. Use of weapons and working on their Elvish, working on everything. And then they had begun shooting, but the character, the actor who was meant to play Strider, Aragorn, um, he's a very good actor actually, but he was deemed to be too young because he was the same age as the Hobbits, basically the actors playing the Hobbits, and it didn't quite work because Aragorn had to have this he had to be older, have lived a long life. He was a sort of had some Elvis blood, so he actually was in actual years far, far older than other humans that looked like him. And so it didn't make sense. They needed someone that was older simply. And so for whatever reason, they decided on me. I don't know what movies they saw or what made them think about it. Or maybe they didn't have many options at that point because it was so late in the game. Um, anyway, so I got the call and I initially resisted it. My son, Henry, who was 11 at the time, was familiar with Lord of the Rings. And when he got wind of when I hung up the phone, he said, is that what I think it is? And he said, well, you should do it. I said, well, it's a very long commitment. And really, I always want to, it's a team sport, making a movie, and everybody has to contribute. And I think I would be at a disadvantage. I don't know this story. They've been there a while. I don't know. They should find an actor who knows Tolkien, and I don't know. It just didn't seem right, but I thought about it. He was insistent, son, and then I thought, it sounds intriguing. 3 movies, shoot them all one after all at the same time. It sounds like a big New Zealand. That could be interesting. I don't know. So I decided to go for it, and obviously I'm glad I did because it opened many doors. Not the movie itself, although it did teach me a lot of things, but the success that the movies had obviously allowed me to work with people like Cronenberg and others. And when I was on the plane, I went out and bought this book quickly, huge. It looked like the New York City telephone book,
Right.
massive thing. And I'm on the plane, this long, 13-hour flight. I didn't sleep. I just started reading. And I thought, what is this? I have no idea. But then I got a little ways into it and I started to recognize, and I went to look at the appendices and story of Arwen and Aragorn. Okay, I know this. I know this. I know where this comes from. I know, because I had been raised uh, with,
Epic
Nordic
poems and right, and
mythology, the
mythology.
sagas, and, you know, certain amount of Celtic stories and mythology as well. And so these things were familiar. There were certain archetypes that I was familiar with. There was a Volsunga saga or Njal saga or even Wagnerian mythos. I could see, okay, I see where they're taking this from. And so I calmed down. I thought, well, this is intriguing. Uh, um, I see what the sources are. And so as soon as I got to Wellington, I did go to a bookstore. I said, I didn't realize this until I started reading the book. So I went out and got a copy of Volsunga Saga and a few other things. And, when got some, it was cassettes at the time, even, or maybe it was CDs. I don't remember, but Wagner and some different things. And I just thought, yeah, I'm going to just start listening to this and reading these things. I had very little time to prep, so I just immersed myself, and it was a great film school in a way for everyone involved, if you chose to look at it that way. To me, the most memorable thing about that experience of shooting with movies with Peter Jackson was the actual making of them, the way that New Zealanders, which by and large made up most of the crew, how they, under Peter Jackson's direction, found ingenious ways to troubleshoot, to solve problems on a daily basis, big ones, little ones. Well, this has not been done. Well, we can do it. Let's just give it a try, or let's make up a new way to shoot something, that hasn't been done before. Who cares? There was this pioneer spirit that they had, never to be repeated in quite the same way, because now these crew members are schooled and have had many experiences. Now there is this big film industry there, right? At the time, there had been not just Peter Jackson, but Jeff Murphy and other filmmakers. There had been a history of making movies in New Zealand, but nothing on that scale.
Yeah.
And so a lot of this hundreds of people in this crew were inexperienced. Some of them had very little or no experience. They'd done some TV work, commercials, a little bit of film work, student films, but they learned on the job along with all the rest of us. And that was the most fascinating thing about it. Just seeing
That's
how you can solve problems, how you prepare, the care, the obsession of each department. I mean, in particular, two artists who had illustrated the most well-known version of Lord of the Rings, John Howe, Canadian, I think. John Howe and Alan Lee. Maybe he's not Canadian, John Howe. But, anyway, Alan Lee's English. And those two were there. There was a workshop, and the drawings, their illustrations, which are beautiful in the Lord of the Rings book. They were designing the sets for Rivendell and North Lothlorien and so forth. It was fantastic to watch all of that happening, all these workshops, and I was constantly zipping around and seeing what they were doing. And you were welcome to walk in, or the Weta
wow.
workshop. And I would say, well, this sword, and it looks like sort of like a Nordic. You're like, yes, it's a combination of taken from this century and then the English style of this. Everything was referenced. Everything, there was a reason for everything. I mean, meticulous care with everything, even the background players, their costumes, the buttons on their tunic. I mean, everything. I don't think that'll ever happen again on that scale.
Yeah.
It's just a remarkable, huge workshop / film school.
That's amazing. I mean, you really do sense, and it comes through in some of the special features on the discs, that at no point at any time would you have a scenic designer or an art director say, it looks that way because I feel like it. There's always thought and care and a reason. And the other thing about a production like that, except that there is no production like that, really, it's one of a kind, is, from Peter Jackson's point of view, it must have seemed like organizing a military campaign, an army with masses of people in front and behind the camera, huge amounts of green screen work, stunts all spread over, a long period of time, lots of different locations, in and out of the studio. Um, did you find it hard to maintain a sense of focus and also continuity in your character over all of those different sort of divides? And did you also find it challenging to maintain the kind of the intensity and intimacy of your relationship with the other characters? Because Lord of the Rings as a book, because it comes from epics, the characters can be a little one-dimensional because they're not really sort of conceived in 20th century fully fleshed human being terms. But in the film, they really do come to life, and you had to make that happen.
Well, as anybody who's read the books knows, the Aragorn in Peter Jackson's trilogy, speaks much less than he does in the books. But I think in most everything he did with the trilogy, what satisfied fans, Tolkien fans, by and large, I think, is that he was fairly faithful to the spirit of the stories, and they were ingenious in using the appendices. And it was a really good adaptation in many ways. He did a great job. And I mean, you had to be on your toes. We were shooting 3 stories and jumping around from story to story on a daily basis sometimes. So you had to work hard to keep your own continuity and be conscious of where you were in the overall story at all times. You always should. But it was a little bit more of a task, I found, in Lord of the Rings, but I welcomed that. I liked sort of jigsaw puzzle of it as we were putting together the story. And also, there were many units shooting. Towards the end, at one point, I think there were 7 different film units with different directors, and big important things. Usually it was Peter Jackson, but not always directing me on the set. I worked with all kinds of directors on that movie. I mean, I counted up my days, and I think it was only around 28 or 30% of my time I was actually directed by Peter Jackson. But he was essentially always directing because he had satellite hookups. He was having a bank of screens where wherever he was shooting, day or night, he would be watching everything that everybody else was doing. And then he would call on the phone and said, "No, I'd like you to do another take, but make this alteration or something."
Right.
Sometimes you'd be shooting, or when you weren't shooting with him, you'd wait between takes until we got a response from him, from mission control, so to speak.
Right.
And so it was a giant enterprise. It was incredible how he got that done. But so so each unit, you'd have a different person keeping track of continuity. It wasn't always the main script supervisor who was Victoria Sullivan, Australian one. And by the way, John Howe, the illustrator, he's from, I think he was born in Vancouver, so he was Canadian. He lives in France and has lived there for many years. And so, I felt it was important that I really keep track of things myself and not just assume that whatever unit I was working with in any given day would be up to speed. Where did we come from before the scene and where were we headed to? So it was a giant enterprise, but I enjoyed watching the collaborative aspect. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. The way that the whole crew felt involved in the story, even in this big sprawling enterprise, which was telling the Lord of the Rings on film, it was still like any small independent film thing where the crew was, rolled their sleeves up and they were welcome to, they were needed to participate. Yes. It wasn't just another job. But the spirit of it, that sort of pioneering spirit, and let's fix it. We'll figure out a way. Yep. It felt like a giant indie film, a giant budgeted indie film or a student film in some ways, where there was experimentation, there was improvisation, just to solve problems on a daily basis.
The Glenn Gould Foundation is a registered Canadian charity, and we rely on the support of arts lovers like you to keep bringing inspiring stories to life. Please consider giving by visiting our website, glenngould.ca, and follow us across social media at the Glenn Gould Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of The Gould Standard.